Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to speak to you today and would like to thank you, the organizers, for the kind invitation to ACCO. Just a few months after the Federal Republic came into being, Franz Redeker, the head of the Health Department in the Federal Ministry of the Interior, wrote a reference letter for Wilhelm Hagen, an old friend from the Weimar years. The fact that 4 years before 1945, Wilhelm Hagen had headed the Health Department in Warsaw and was the person who issued the epidemic prevention recommendation that led to the establishment of the Warsaw Ghetto, did not lead Redeker to reconsider writing the reference. In fact, Redeker didn't even mention Hagen's role under National Socialism. As for Hagen's membership in the NSDAP, he simply dismissed it as a temporary formal deviation which need not be taken seriously. This rewriting of Hagen's attitude towards National Socialism shows how mutual recommendation letters could serve to exculpate individuals. However, it also shows how the past after 1945 could be reinterpreted. One could even say reproduced. This practice points to processes of conversion and transformation that characterize the transition from dictatorship to democracy in the West Germany after 1945. Together with 7 other colleagues from the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, Berlin, and the Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam, I am currently looking into the continuities and breaks between National Socialism and 2 post-war German ministries, the Federal Ministry of the Interior and the Ministry of Interior of the German Democratic Republic. Here you can see our webpage, you can see some results of our project. The project reflects a wider contemporary German trend to research the post-war history of national ministries. This began with a study you may have heard of entitled The Office, das Amt, which dealt with the West German Foreign Ministry. Our historical commission has already come to some first results. I will only mention these briefly here. The Federal Ministry of the Interior was formed in 1949 after the founding of the Federal Republic, under the leadership of the First Minister of the Interior, Gustav Heinemann. We have investigated both formal liability, that means Belastung in German, namely membership in the NSDAP and other National Socialist organizations, and the individual paths of employees at the executive level over the period 1949 to 1970. Of the 317 people we have investigated, around 51% and around 1960, even up to around 2/3 of this personnel were former members of the NSDAP. So-called Alt-PGs, namely people who had joined the party before 1933, were not usually recruited. However, there were exceptions to this rule at the lower levels. Membership in the SA and SS, especially when it was associated with a particular function, was viewed with suspicion by the personnel department. But this was not necessarily disqualifying either. On average, 26% of the staff on executive level were former members of the SA and 6% were former members of the SS. We are currently further examining specific incriminating moments on the basis of individual biographies. As one of the historians in this commission, I am focusing on the Health Department of the Federal Ministry of the Interior. This is, well, of course, I'm here. I will begin by giving you a short insight into my first findings. Since most of those working in the Health Department of the Ministry of the Interior were physicians, the issue of liability is harder to grasp. After 1945, physicians were needed to accomplish tasks requiring expert knowledge such as healthcare, food hygiene, or epidemic control. In the health department, therefore, the continuities in terms of personnel and competency between National Socialism and the Federal Republic need to be placed in a wider, subject-specific context. In the area of health, doctrines, traditions, positions are the result of long-term developments. And the political turning points of 1933 and 1945 can only have influenced or affected this to a limited extent. Looking into the persistence of mental postures in the Ministry of the Interior after 1949 reveals the importance of doctrines, attitudes, and traditions such as eugenics, which developed long before 1933 and were widespread internationally too. Any approach to the health department must therefore go beyond the limits of a particular system or temporary demarcations. In addition, the actions of individuals in the West German health sector always took place in relation to one another in a dense network of relationships which was determined by the system itself. This is the reason why I have chosen to foreground the social context and personal relationships of the actors within the health sector. Firstly, my research has shown that there was a high level of continuity on the level of personnel between the health system of the Third Reich and the health system in the health department of the Federal Ministry of the Interior. This is not an institutional continuity. Only 3 employees of the health department were previously employed in the Department of People's Health, German Volksgesundheit, of the Reich Ministry of the Interior. Rather, the continuity consists of a transfer of individuals from the National Socialist health sector, such as the regional and local public health departments, into the new ministry. And it was these public health departments which had, in the Third Reich, which had been the authorities responsible for the implementation of the so-called racial hygiene programs, including forced sterilizations and the registration of so-called lives unworthy of life. This continuity can also be explained by the fact that the physicians of the health department already knew each other long before 1949. They recommended each other, recruited each other in the Federal Ministry of the Interior, or exonerated colleagues, as I mentioned at the start. In particular, the head of the department, Franz Rediker, was familiar with the people he recruited into the department. These relationships were not only among physicians, but also, you know it, between doctors and lawyers, as mutual exculpation in the context of post-war trials have shown. For the purpose of research, the social context and personal relationships, I have conducted an extensive network analysis, which I have visually represented as follows. The inner dark blue circle represents the health department. It is surrounded by a ring of advisors and experts which were named by the department. The outer circle represents the wider area of the health sector after 1945. The polygons on the outer rim represent the pre-1945 institutions and departments for which the physicians worked. I will not be able to go into much detail, you know it, concerning this complex network of relationships as a whole here today, and I have therefore chosen to focus on specific aspects of it. But a quick look, you feel it, at this graph is sufficient to get an impression of the diverse and complex ways in which the health department of the ministry and the wider health sector were interwoven after 1945. The case of employees of the health department who had worked in the occupied territories before 1945 illustrates the significance of acquaintance made working under National Socialism. As you can see here, before 1945, It's like a zoom. Otto Burmann, Werner Borgolte, Johannes Haupt, Wilhelm Hagen, Kurt Hoffmann and Josef Daniels all worked for the health service in the occupied territories, in the public health departments of Warsaw, Krakow, or in the Reichsgau-Wartheland, or for the Institute for Typhus and Virus Research of the German Army's High Command in Krakow. These people all knew each other before 1945 and were reunited in the Federal Ministry of the Interior. All of them knew the head of the department, Franz Redeker, personally, and this considerably facilitated their entry into the civil service after 1945. The physicians in the health department are, as you can see by the names, not doctors who stood out for having had a clearly criminal past. This would not have been publicly acceptable in the new Federal Republic. There were nevertheless people who had worked for the National Socialist health system, in some cases at the highest level, for example, Franz Redeker. How? This is precisely where there is an interesting finding to be made, namely that these physicians were not only familiar with those working in the department, but as a result of their early occupation, they were also well connected with more seriously incriminated doctors, and they relied on this as advisors, consultants and experts for the management of health policy in the Federal Republic. Thus, in 1950, a new council of the Federal Board of Health, in German Bundesgesundheitsrat, was created, following the tradition of the Reich Board of Health dating from before 1945. It was filled with people who were often personally known to employees of the ministry and had close links to National Socialism insofar as they were implicated in its crimes or even co-responsible for what happened. The task of the 72 members of this board was to advise the federal government on matters of public health and the preparation of health legislation. In his opening speech at the constituent meeting of the council of this board in April 1953 in the plenary hall of the Federal Assembly, Franz Redeker reminded attendees that healthy policy was about taking responsibility for people in need. Quote, all other considerations, even if they are important and even if they offer fruitful prospects, should be aligned with and subsumed to this fundamental principle. End of quote. Redeker's words were directed at people who, just a few years before, had ignored this fundamental ethical medical principle in the most gruesome of ways. So, for instance, Adolf Butenandt, perhaps you know the man, the former director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Biochemistry, had participated in human trials on epileptic children in the psychiatric hospital Brandenburg-Bernburg and been in contact with Josef Mengele. After 1945, he was, among other things, the president of the Max Planck Society. You can see him here at the bottom on the left among members of the Council of the Federal Board of Health. Or Hermann Eyer, who had made a name for himself as typhus expert and, before 1945, tested a typhus vaccine on detainees of the concentration camp Buchenwald. Eyer was the director of the previously mentioned Institute for the Typhus and Virus Research of the German Army's High Command in Krakow. With this, he was also Josef Daniels' former boss, whom I also mentioned above, who worked in the Ministry of the Interior and who later became the president of the German Health Authority, Bundesgesundheitsamt in German. Hermann Eyer was also the one who, in 1955, finalized the testing regulations for the polio vaccine. Remarkable, many of the physicians who belonged to the Council of the Federal Board of Health had already been members of Karl Brandt's scientific board before 1945, as this graph clearly indicates on the right side. More research is required to establish the extent to which the Council, with its advisory function, exerted direct influence on the health policy of the post-war period. Also appointed to the Council of the Federal Board of Health was Hans Nachtheim. Nachtheim took part before 1945 when he was the director of the Department of Experimental Inherited Pathologies at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology. He took part in experiments in genetics and eugenics involving low pressure and oxygen deprivation. Nachtheim embodies another important finding of my research to date, the involvement of heavily incriminated National Socialist doctors as advisors and experts in matters of compensation of, for example, people who were subject to forced sterilization by the National Socialist regime. The law of the Prevention of Genetically Diseased Offspring, in German Gesetz zur Verhütung erbkranken Nachwuchses, that was passed on 40th July 1933 and legalized, in contrast to the sterilization laws of other countries, the use of force and open violence against those affected, was not, you know it, abrogated by the Allies after 1945. At least 360,000 men and women had been victims of the law. Thousands had died as a result. Yet, since the law was not abrogated in 1945, the victims of forced sterilization were not included after 1949 in the law of the compensation of victims of National Socialism. And since they were not recognized as victims of National Socialist prosecution, they were not entitled to any compensation. When the German Parliament put the inclusion of the law on compensation of people who had been sterilized by force once again on the agenda of the Compensation Committee, the Health Department of the Ministry of the Interior appointed several experts to the committee, who were to give a recommendation as experts on this subject. The subject of sterilization highlights once again the influence of long-standing traditions in medicine and science. Sterilizations had been endorsed since the end of the 19th century and in the 1930s. They not only gained support in the German Reich, but also in other countries. For example, in Switzerland, in some North American states, or in Scandinavia, albeit under different circumstances and within different legal basic conditions. But the fact is that the endorsement of sterilization after 1945, therefore, did not necessarily immediately point to National Socialist criminality. The employees of the Health Department of the Ministry of the Interior were mostly aware of the activities of the consultants under National Socialism. They nevertheless appointed precisely those doctors who, as the experienced genetic theorists of the Weimar period, had worked on the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring, had acted after 1933 as advisors to the hereditary health courts, and who, as judge, had ruled on forced sterilizations. These specialists were now to advise on whether these same people should receive compensation. Hans Nachtheim, whom I mentioned above, was an important consultant. At the meeting of the Compensation Committee, Nachtheim justified the law on forced sterilization of the National Socialist regime as an, quote, apolitical law that was designed to protect the hereditary health of the German people, and continued to advocate the exclusion of the genetically ill from reproduction. End of quote. This was 1965. Another consultant was Professor Werner Villinger, a former expert on the T4 and advisor to the Hereditary Health Supreme Court. At that point, he was full professor in Marburg and the president of the German Association for Child Psychiatry. He feared that the compensation of the forcible sterilization would do a great deal of harm, since it would lead to, quote, neurotic pains and suffering, which would not only impair the previous well-being and the happiness of these people, but also their capabilities. Based on the arguments of the consultants, the Compensation Committee decided that the law on hereditary health should not be regarded as a typical National Socialist law, and therefore that forcibly sterilized people were not to be included in the law on compensation. This group of people were not able to claim compensation until 1980, when a hardship fund was set up especially for them. When, in 2007, the issue of their inclusion in the compensation regulation was discussed once more, a matter also involving their recognition as victims of the National Socialist regimes, the then Finance Minister Per Steinbrück rejected the idea on the basis that when the Compensation Committee met in 1965, many aspects had been carefully considered, and this following the consultation of leading experts from the field of psychiatry. I'm coming now to the conclusion. If one looks at the networks and personal continuities represented here, it becomes clear how complex the issue of liability, personal continuity, and its effects on the young Federal Republic actually was. There can be no simple answers. The employees of the health department were part of a professional group that was shaped by long-term developments and perspectives. As was the case when the system changed in 1933, there were also in 1945 broad programmatic areas on convergence. This means that members of the Federal Ministry of the Interior were not only closely connected with the health sector behind the ministry, but also worked behind the smoke screen of expertise, together with doctors who, from today's perspective, are regarded as seriously culpable. Only the generational change of the 1960s and the simultaneous rising sensitivity for medical crimes under National Socialism, as well as their more consistent tracking down at the end of the 1960s, were able to break off these long-standing traditions and mentalities. In some branches of the medical profession, such as psychiatry, this took until the end of the 20th century. The complex network of relationship presented here and visually represented in the graph, and in which the Department of the Federal Ministry of the Interior was embedded, established and reproduced the self-made image on the physicians and scientists who was not implicated in past crimes. This prevented the working through of these people's actions after the war. Like a kind of carrier system, this network of relationships enabled long-standing medical traditions and doctrines to inform the policies of the young Federal Republic. Embedded in this network of relationships and protected by mutual support and exoneration, the question why one had not rejected the NS regime was no longer a priority for the employees of the health department. The many biographies of repressed and persecuted doctors could have shown that all doctors under National Socialism had had a chance to oppose the regime. These physicians, however, hardly ever made it into the Ministry of the Interior. People kept to themselves. Thank you very much.